So thank you all today for joining us for Carnegie classification, updates, and an overview with the American Council on Education. Slide. So I would like to take a moment to thank our 2024 annual conference platinum sponsor, Push Blackwell, for sponsoring today's event. Push Blackwell's higher education team has decades of experience representing institutions nationwide. Our team provides strategic and comprehensive regulatory counseling regarding compliance with the Department of Education, rules regarding federal financial student aid, like Title IV, state regulatory requirements, and the complexities of mergers, acquisitions, and change of control transactions. We can help with in-depth policy and procedure audits to identify and remedy potential liabilities. To learn more about Push Blackwell, visit pushblackwell.com. So welcome to everyone. My name is Bridget Booty. I am the Senior Director for Policy and Records Management at the Commission, and I will be facilitating today's question and answer portion of this, and I will take a moment to turn it over to our presenter for today.
Hey friends, Mushtaq Ganja, Executive Director, Carnegie Classifications. I'm also Senior Vice President here at ACE, and I am thrilled to get to hang out with all of you and tell you a little bit about what we've been up to and the sort of the plan for the Carnegie Classifications updates. So I am a law professor by training. I'm still in the classroom a bunch. Please feel free to interrupt and throw questions in the Q&A, and Bridget and I will try to figure this out, and we'll make sure to answer those questions that you put in there. So thanks so much. And if I can start sharing screen, if somebody wouldn't mind throwing that down. Thank you all. All right, get to slideshow. All right, so friends, Carnegie classifications. So I presented at the Middle States annual meeting last year, and I told you all then that we were redoing this entire sort of Carnegie classification system. Carnegie classification has been around for 50 years. They came over to the American Council on Education in 2022, right after the 22 classifications were published. And when we took the project on, we said that we were going to reimagine sort of the classifications. And we were really focused on that blue box in the middle. You know, we announced to the world in 2022 that we were going to create this new social and economic mobility classification, and indeed it is coming. But we also, in 22 and 23, realized that we needed to make some changes to the basic classification. And so that little asterisk next to the basic classification is just meant to signify that we're about to revise that too. So in 2025, just to remind everybody, every institution in this country, including all of yours, will have at least 2 classifications. Every institution will have a new basic classification, and we'll have a new social and economic mobility classification. And then if your institution is one of those institutions that does a lot of research, then we will also separately publish a research list of R1 institutions, R2 institutions, and a new RCU category that I'll talk about in a second. I am hoping today just to do a very brief overview of some of the work that we've done over the last couple of years on the basic and on the research side, just remind you of some of those changes. But I want to spend the most of our time today talking about this approach that we have to this new social and economic mobility classification that's coming. So happy to take questions on any of it, but I think that's where we're going to spend most of our time on that new SEM classification. Okay, but just as a reminder, here's what we announced in November of last year, that we were going to shift this basic classification, this thing that's been around now for 50 years, that has always really grouped institutions by the highest degree that they offered. So you were a doctoral university if you offered PhDs, or a master's university if you offered master's degrees. You know, we're going to shift that to something that's more multidimensional, which hopefully will better reflect sort of the diversity of higher education today, the breadth of missions. And we made some announcements around research. So we super simplified the research methodology, and we created a new category of research colleges and universities. Before I get into what those are, let me just show you what the quick timeline is for what the next few months are going to look like, so you have some sense. So we are in the currently gathering feedback stage, and we're about to make some final decisions on some methodological questions on the social and economic mobility work. So this is an excellent time for us to be able to chat, for you to be able to give a couple of suggestions, and I can take them back. In November and December, we will communicate with all of you what sort of the exact dates are for release of the classifications and a process for appeal. And then in January, we will actually provide all of your institutions their draft classifications. So you will know what your draft basic classification is, your social and economic mobility, and your research classification if you have one. We'll give you a little bit of time to digest and then to appeal to us if you feel like you're in the wrong group for one reason or another. You'll have less time to appeal the research work, probably about 4 or 5 weeks, and then a couple of months at least to review your basic and social and economic mobility work. In spring of next year, think late March, early April, something like that, we will publish the full new Carnegie classifications, including the social and economic mobility work. And then the fun begins after that. We're going to do all the things that are in that light purple box with this new set of groupings, including a whole bunch of analysis, hopefully, and a bunch of presentations about what the new classifications are. And if we do this right, hopefully we'll be able to convince some folks to adopt this new classification regime. What's the revised basic going to look like? Well, I showed you this slide back at last year's annual meeting, but it is a new sort of what I call sort of a Myers-Briggs approach to classification. Instead of just focusing on one thing, highest degree, I think we're going to look at a breadth of sort of factors here, and then hopefully allow you also to be able to sort of make your own grouping. So, instead of just looking at highest degree, we can imagine that we'll look at some version of an institution's program mix, your primary degree awarded. We might still look at sort of the range of types of degrees, including your highest degree awarded, put all that together, to hopefully be able to provide the world sort of more of a 360-degree view of what your institution is. Because of that, you're almost certainly going to have some set of new groupings. So, the master's large category, which currently is like 650 institutions, will almost certainly get broken up into a bunch of different categories that are focused on, at least a few of these criterion. So you can see here that, this institution here that's got sort of an award level focus that's like of type B. So let's say they offer master's and bachelor's institutions. That's like a type B category. They've got more of a humanities focus. That might be like a type G. Their highest degree might be master's, type I, and they might be a medium institution, type M. We would categorize them as a BGIM, right? So I'm an old ENFJ on the Myers-Briggs scale, right? You might have that sort of categorization. We're trying to play with whether we label these in sort of some different ways. I'm sure that we will. So we're still working on all of that. But the basic idea here is, we've got some categories, and you'll have a type in each of those categories, which will then come together to create a grouping, and almost certainly a new set of groupings than what you're potentially used to. We also made some changes to the research side, as I referenced, and we moved away from the very complicated research methodology that we had been using to distinguish R1s from R2s, and we went to a simple threshold approach. So in 2025, any institution that has spent more than $50 million in sort of R&D expenditures and has awarded more than 70 research degrees in a single year will be an R1 institution. And that's sort of regardless of what those dollars are spent on and what types of degrees you're conferring in. So it doesn't matter if you do 70 humanities PhDs or 70 STEM degrees or some combination thereof, just as long as there's 70 research degrees and $50 million worth of expenditures, your institution will be an R1. That R2 category will remain unchanged. We've had that same criteria for being an R2, $5 million in R&D and 20 research doctorates for several cycles, and we're going to keep that number the same for this coming cycle in 25. And then I've made reference to this new category, this third category, research colleges and universities. I couldn't be more thrilled to create this category. There's a lot of research happening all throughout the higher ed ecosystem that aren't happening in our R1s and R2s. And in fact, there's more research happening in the research colleges and universities bucket than there is in sort of the R2 category. So for all your institutions that are doing some amount of research, but aren't offering, more than 20 PhDs or maybe even any PhDs, we're going to start recognizing that in the Carnegie system. One of the things that we've really heard from funders is, we'd love to diversify who we're sending dollars to. We're not totally sure how to think about the whole breadth of the universe. And so what we're trying to do a little bit is be able to shine light on institutions that are doing a good amount of research, but haven't sort of traditionally been thought of as our research colleges and universities. So hopefully this will be good for faculty. It'll be good for students who are thinking about sort of their undergraduate experience. It'll be good for funders. We're really excited by this new category. Last thing to note, for the 25 classifications down on the bottom in the gold, it notes that institutions will receive the higher of either their 3-year average or their most recent single year's worth of data. In years past, we only looked at the most recent single year. We're moving to more of a 3-year rolling average, which I think is the right thing to do. It smooths out the data, corrects for some like weird anomalous years. So we're excited by that. And going forward, we're only going to use the 3-year rolling average. But this year, given that we made changes sort of midstream, we're going to give you the higher of either your 3-year average or your most recent single year. Very excited by these changes, and happy to take questions on them. I think what I'm going to do though is probably go through the social and economic mobility work and then come back and talk to you a little bit about and see if there are questions on any of this work that I just presented. A couple of reflections as we think about the social and economic mobility work that we're doing and some of the things that have inspired the revisions to the basic. When I took this project on, I don't think I fully realized, my team and I fully realized all the ways in which the Carnegie classifications are used throughout higher ed. So, I mean, it's everything from faculty recruiting to it's the base for US News doing their rankings. It's in all sorts of grant applications. When I was at the Department of Education, I was in the US Department of Education, and we used to have these grants that would come through our Office of Post-Secondary Education. First question, what's your Carnegie classification? It mattered for grouping institutions, certainly in states, as we're going to talk about in a second. But accreditors use these too. So middle states and others, the regionals mostly, will use the Carnegie classifications to do an initial sort of types of institutions, right? So as to make sure that they're not comparing, an institution that's a huge doctoral producing institution to a community college, for instance. So the Carnegie classifications have been used everywhere. And it turns out that because of their wide use, it's really important for us to be able to get those groupings correct. And when we got to the guts of the classifications, one of the things that we noted was maybe we weren't grouping like institutions together. It's part of the reason that we need to do that Myers-Briggs sort of new set of groupings, because the range of ways in which third parties are using these classifications is really pretty wide. And lately, I've been spending some time thinking about the states. So my team and I have done a little bit of a dive into the ways in which states are using these classifications to make policy funding and other decisions. And we found at least 25 states are using the Carnegie classifications in one way, shape, or form. I actually think it's a little bit of an undercount. There's some states that we know are using them that aren't even on this list. But there's a range of ways in which this is used, from funding decisions. So, North Carolina, Tennessee, Louisiana, South Dakota, just on this page, but there's many more that are using it for things from just straight institutional funding to things that are a little bit smarter around performance-based funding. There's other ways in which these things get used, including for faculty pay. Goodness knows, probably don't have to tell many of you that many states are focused on this R1, R2 chase as our institutions. So, state after state, we have observed have either dedicated funding or have really thought about faculty teaching loads through the lens of making their institutions R1 institutions for classification purposes. So here's a list of some of those, again, non-exhaustive. And the classifications get used in other weird ways too. Again, faculty workload for Kansas. We have a set of elective classifications. Florida, Maryland, Minnesota have all been really focused on trying to get their institutions in community engagement classified. Oklahoma's thinking about this for educator prep programs. They're used everywhere in all sorts of different ways. And if you have more examples to share with me, email them over. I'd love to know, love to be able to fill out these slides even more. But man, I mean, it really feels like the classifications are used more and more often. And one of the things I think that this really has led us to think about is, what's the right way to think about a social and economic mobility classification? How can we create something that is useful to third parties, including those states? So here's our thought on the social and economic mobility work. Let me start here. The first place we started, maybe the first place anybody would start when they were thinking about creating something new, was just to like do a survey of what's out there, what's the existing sort of landscape. And there are no shortage of social and economic mobility rankings that are out there. And here's a view of some of them, and with some of the data that they use. And I think that when I took this project on, I think one of the things we thought was maybe we would just try to look at all the rankings that are out there and then create the best ranking. Do a social and economic mobility ranking. Maybe if I found some new piece of data or weighted in a slightly different way, maybe we'd be able to like really create something that was great. And for reasons that I'll talk about in just a second, we ended up deciding not to do a ranking and to really lean into the classification work that we did. One thing I will say though, is that when I looked at these rankings, one of the things I observed pretty quickly was that these rankings weren't doing a particularly good job of taking context into account. I mean that in a couple of ways. First, these tended to be rankings from 1 to 1,400 or 1 to 4,000 of all the institutions in this country, just on the same scale, as if it made sense to sort of compare Swarthmore to Bucks Community College. I mean, these are very different places that are have different missions, serving different populations. They all got sort of compared to each other. Very strange, I thought. And then the second thing was that there weren't really adjustments that were being made for things like geography. And so we were just looking at some institutions' earnings and comparing it to somebody else's without doing any of the adjustments that one might do to sort of recognize that the earning power in New York City is different than the earning power in the Mississippi Delta. So I sort of came about, some of the learnings from these existing rankings were, there's a whole set of factors that might be distorting or affecting maybe institutions' sort of outcomes. And we learned that there are ways in which we might be able to account for some of these factors and try to produce some more meaningful results. So that's the work. That's what we're trying to do sort of going forward. And here is our approach. So at a high level, when I say we're going to lean into the classifications and my worry around sort of ranking institutions from 1 to 1,400, I think the first step in sort of assessing anybody's social and economic mobility, any institution's SEM, is really to first group meaningfully similar institutions. That's why we spent so much time thinking about this new Myers-Briggs approach, trying to make sure that we were comparing like institutions. It seemed really important that we create groups of meaningfully similar institutions, groups that are 150, 200, maybe 250 institutions big, so not like 20 institutions, but also not the full 4,000 meaningfully similar institutions. And then we are going to assess your institutions on 2 measures, one on access and the second on outcomes. So what's the access that you're providing the populations, the states, the cities, locales in which you serve? And then how are those students doing when they go out into the post attendance? What's happening to them? How are they doing earnings wise? And I think we can do that accounting for the location of the students and produce something that's pretty meaningful. We are hoping to present these results in sort of in something that's pretty visual and a little bit less just straight spreadsheet that hopefully we'll be able to do more to illuminate than obscure. Again, not a fan of rankings. The American Council on Education never has been. And I just don't think it tells us very much when an institution's 400 and another institution's 700. I think we need to know what's going on underneath, really. So what we're not doing, we're not creating a ranking. We're not going to duplicate some of the existing efforts that are out there. There's some straight ROI work, very interesting, that's happening at the state level, maybe even at middle states. We're not doing that. We're doing something a little bit different than that. And we didn't design the system to either penalize or reward any particular type of institution. We're just going to let the data sort of speak for itself. A couple of observations about like sort of context and what we're going to be doing. First thing, our sector has been moving in a positive way on completion over time, but we're still only graduating about 6 in 10 of our of the folks that sort of enter our institutions. Because of that, I think we thought it was really important that we use a measure that accounts for all students, not just the completers. We didn't want to leave the other 40% sort of on the table and not think about them. So we're going to be using measures that look at all students. We also realized that it's really important when we think about context to account for the type of degrees that your institution is offering, right? So here's the tree map of all the degrees that are the bachelor's degrees that are offered in this country, and sort of by the top fields, you can see sort of the breakdown. And one of the things that I sort of know is by looking at the data is that the earning power for our engineering folks really differs from the sort of earning power of the education folks. Really important for us to be able to distinguish schools that are really leaning into engineering from those that are have a different sort of program mix. Because if you're comparing the earnings of engineers to teachers, you're going to have pretty different results. We can account for that in some of the groupings work that we're doing. We really understand how important that is. We've heard from many stakeholders that it would be unfair to compare institutions that have very different degree mixes. Totally get that. We're going to work on that. I've got a few slides here about the importance of location. I'll do them quickly, because I think there's probably stuff that you inherently know, but like when we look at the Pell enrollment across states, we can see that it varies pretty widely. So that if some institution were to say, look, we've got a 30% Pell number, is that good? Is that not good? Are they serving the state? Are they not? Well, it depends a little bit on which state you're in, right? So 30% Pell enrollment in New Mexico, right, which has sort of a 40% overall Pell enrollment, maybe not quite as good, but it might be really good for a different state. And man, we really know this is true as it relates to students of color, right? So, 35, 40% population of students of color. Well, that means something different potentially in Hawaii, than it does in Idaho or North Dakota or something like that. So we can take some of that into account as we think about, assessing access. Because again, we want to be really fair to institutions. We see, of course, the results by state and income too, right? So not every state is created equal when it comes to sort of potential earning power. You can see the differences between, DC and in Montana, a pretty big variation. And so another thing that we can take into account. By the way, we also know that income varies quite a bit by race, especially in those first few years after attendance. And so another thing that we know that we can adjust for, so that an institution that's graduating or that's enrolling, a lot of African-American students or a lot of Native American students, their earning power will likely be a little bit diminished from a school that's enrolling primarily Asian students. We can do some of that work on the back end to do some adjustments as well. By the way, once you put all of that together, right, income by state and by race and ethnicity, you can see these results, which are not meant to be read or interpreted, except to say there's some highs and there's some lows, right? And the existing rankings that are out there basically don't account for any of these things related to context. Seems like a mistake to me, because I think we can do some work here to really try to make this thing more meaningful and more fair to all institutions. By the way, median earnings vary not only across states, but also, of course, within states. Another thing that we can sort of take into account. So that a community college student in Austin, Texas, and a community college student in the Rio Grande Valley down at the border are going to have pretty different earning potential, especially if they end up staying in their locations. And so we can do some work on that side too, to be able to adjust earnings based on the locale of the institution, if you are indeed an institution that's a little bit more regional and serves students from a particular part of your state. And by the way, we know that there's a whole set of institutions that are primarily drawing from either one state or a couple of states, and then some that are more national in scope. And we know from looking at the data where your students are coming from at your institution. So we know what percent of your students are coming from California and New York and all 50 states, and can do some analysis there. In our bachelor's institutions, you can see sort of the fun variation here in terms of how many students how many schools have students that are coming just basically from one school, and then how many of our institutions are more national in scope. When you look at our associates colleges, our community colleges, not surprising, right? Most of our institutions have most of their students either coming from 1, 2, or sometimes 3 states. But at the associate college level, most of our students are, most of those colleges are regional in nature, and mostly are drawing not just from within the state, but from within the region itself. We have good data on where your students are coming from. That's all reported through iPads. We have less perfect data on where your students are going after attendance, but we've done a little bit of work on some alumni surveys and some other work to be able to sort of get some sense of where students are coming from. So here's some Arizona data for the 3 big universities in Arizona: ASU, Northern Arizona, and University of Arizona. And we can see that for those schools, about somewhere around 60% of their students are coming from Arizona. And we can see sort of 4 years after attendance, there's a little bit of a drop off, but still most of the students are staying in Arizona, which gives us some ability to think about the right ways to use sort of post-attendance earnings and what we should adjust to. And then you can see sort of the drop off over time, but that helps us think about when we should start thinking about calculating earnings and outcomes. And we've done some alumni work too, to be able to sort of see where students are coming from, and or where they are going afterwards. And from a whole bunch of alumni maps, we've been able to sort institutions into institutions that are a little bit more regional, and then those that are a little bit more national, where their students are going everywhere and then earning sort of everywhere in the country. So that's a lot of fun. It's been a tremendous amount of getting to look at all of your data has been a joy. Here is, by the way, I should say, again, we took the project on March 22, and I think now we have presented to / gotten feedback from in groups that are as small as just a couple to, webinars that, have 250 people in them. We've gotten feedback, I think, now from something like 15,000 folks in all sorts of different ways, small groups, big groups. And here's some key principles and some key takeaways, some things that we've thought about as we've decided how to craft this new social and economic mobility work. First, we need universal data. So institutions sometimes tell us, can you assess us on X thing that we're tracking? And that X is often really interesting, really important, but not everybody in the universe is sort of tracking things that way. So we have to be able to rely on universal data to be able to compare across all institutions. We're the Carnegie classifications of higher ed, and we classify all 4,000 degree granting institutions, so I need universal data. That doesn't mean that there isn't really cool underlying data that some of you have. We'd love to hear about some of it. Maybe we can highlight some of it, but it won't be in the base sort of classification. We really are striving to make our approach relatively simple, relatively understandable. I think going back to that one ranking slides of all the other rankings, some of those rankings, I think they're cool. I think they're really smart people that are putting it together, but they're hard to understand sometimes. I was talking to the president of one of the institutions that was sort of in the top 10 of one of those rankings, and I said, congratulations, amazing. And the president said, yep, it's wonderful. I have no idea what they're using or how we got there. I'm happy that we're top 10. I think we're doing a good job, but I have no idea how we got there. We don't want that. I think we want you to be able to really very clearly understand where you are in the social and economic mobility work. And this isn't the last time we're going to be doing this. We are lucky to be able to publish these classifications every 3 years. And I hope that 3 years from now, I'll come back and I'll tell you about the tweaks that we're making to the social and economic mobility classification, because we think that we're going to be able to keep iterating on this thing. Location, race, really important. I think we're going to be able to do some good adjustments. Award degrees, incredibly important. We got to use all students. And this last bullet on the second column, the data's not perfect, but it's better than it was when I was at the department in 2014. I think there's enough data there that we can do some good analysis and really be able to understand, where institutions are. It's not perfect. We won't claim that it is, and we're going to push to get better and better data. But I think the point that we sort of have heard is that there's enough data out there that we can be useful to the field. we're hoping to be. Okay, that was a lot of throat clearing. Let me tell you what this is going to look like. It looks like we really are likely to move to something that is a 2x2 or a 3x3 approach. So I said a few slides ago, we were going to assess institutions, how well they were doing on access and outcomes. And I think it's, for us, it's important to actually tease those two things apart. We think they're different concepts, and we think they're both independently important to measure. So we are going to measure how well you're doing on access, measure how well you're doing on outcomes. And if we were to do so, this is a group that we've been playing with a little bit. I've kept it unlabeled, but it is a group in our sort of new Myers-Briggs approach. And you can see it's got about 150 dots or so. Each dot is an institution. You can see a whole range here of institutions that are doing an excellent job on access, that are represented sort of here on the right-hand side of the screen, and some that are lower access, and then some institutions that are higher outcomes, and then some that are sort of lower outcomes. The point in sort of graphing it this way is to be able to really help institutions understand how well they're doing on both things, and then see how well they're doing compared to other institutions as well. So obviously, green box is where you want to be, the orange box, not where you want to be. And then there's a whole set of institutions here that are doing well on one or the other, and they'll know sort of where to focus their energies to do a little bit better on this classification. This orange box is going to be of special importance, I think, to our accreditors, to our states, as they think about institutions that really might need to improve a little bit and where they might need to improve. We've been thinking about 2x2. We've also been playing with a 3x3, right? So trying to figure out, which will provide more sort of meaningful results as we think about this work. And so more on that to come, but I want you to know that we really are committed to the access and the outcomes, and exactly how we present the data. We're still in sort of the last couple of weeks worth of discussions. Okay, how are we going to measure access and outcomes? This is maybe the million-dollar question. Let me make this basically our last slide for now. On access, I think that we are moving toward thinking about sort of a 50-50 split in measuring how well your institutions are doing in enrolling Pell students, and then enrolling students of color. And both are relative to the location your students are coming from. So if 90% of your students are from Idaho, we would look at the racial demographics and the Pell enrollments for Idaho, and then compare 90% of sort of the median, or the 90% of the total of your school to Idaho, and then look at where the rest of your students are coming from, and then compare the rest of your students' states to the Pell enrollment and racial composition of those states. That's access. And we'll pull it all from iPads. And then on outcomes, we're thinking about a relatively simple measure: post-attendance earnings of all your federally aided students, adjusted for race, adjusted for location. We know from census data where how much students in any given demographic are earning. And so we can compare how well your students are doing to how the rest of the population is doing, and do a sort of an actual to predicted earnings. And that will spit out a sort of a coefficient, a number, and we will plot that onto this map, both on the access side and on the outcome side. And this will be the way that we sort of present this classification. At least that's the lean for now. So let me pause here. Actually, I'm going to keep it up on this slide so that folks can digest this if they have questions here. And Bridget, let me stop and see if folks have questions.
Sure. And just as a reminder for folks, you can submit your questions through the Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. If you have not yet already, we've had a few folks that have pre-submitted, and then stuff that's come in during the presentation. So specifically, we had a couple questions on this. What constitutes a research doctorate? So do professional practice doctoral certifications or conferrals, are they not counted under the new methodology?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for it. So I think, as you probably know, IPEDS sorts out professional practice doctorates from research doctorates. So I'm a lawyer. My JD is a professional practice doctorate under the IPEDS definitions, because it is a doctorate that is primarily for the purpose of practicing a profession. And they distinguish those types of doctorates from research doctorates, which are basically for the production of knowledge and not so much for the production of professions. And we count for our R1, R2 classifications and just the research doctorates, not the professional practice doctorates. And that's the number that we will sort of count. That distinguishment of professional practice from research is something that each institution does on their own when they make their reports over to IPEDS. And I'm assuming that states and accreditors are sort of looking at the data to make sure that it's correct. But Carnegie's not doing an additional analysis. We're just pulling that data of your number of research doctorates and professional practice doctorates from IPEDS. That's a great question. Thank you, Bridget.
And then we had another couple questions. This was a repeat one also about if research classifications will be evaluated annually. And so, for example, if an institution doesn't meet R1 this year, but meets the requirements next year, will that be evaluated then to reflect their status?
Yeah, great question. It's not evaluated annually. It's evaluated every 3 years. The classifications are published every 3 years. They have been now for the last however many cycles. And before that, it was more like every 5 or 7 years. So it's every 3 years. We want sort of a stable classification. And so that's what it will be going forward. That said, I mean, the simple threshold approach makes it sort of clear where you're going and where you're going to be. And so, I think you'll have some sense of how difficult it'll be for you, or how likely it is that your institution will be classified sort of on a going forward basis. I should say one thing about the thresholds. Going back several slides, I noted, of course, that the thresholds for $25 or $50 million of expenditures, 70 research doctorates. We will revisit those numbers every cycle. So sometime in probably 2026, the team will let everybody know what the thresholds will be in 28. I think it's quite likely, I should just give all of you a heads up, that $50 million of expenditures will probably go up as inflation sets in, as the amount of research that's happening across our ecosystem goes up. That number will probably move. And I want to make sure that you have enough time to be able to respond. So I will tell you what that number will be sometime in advance. But I don't think that we quite know yet what it's going to be. I want to see what the data looks like in 24 and 25 as herd comes in before we make that call. So just to let you know. But thank you for the questions.
We also have a question from someone asking how the reclassification takes international student populations under consideration, particularly for institutions with sizable amounts of international students.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a little bit of this is a place where we've got a little bit of weakness in the data. So with international students, we don't typically know the earnings of those students. And so they're going to be taken out of the denominator for the social and economic mobility work. They will count for purposes of, degrees and degree types. And so in some ways they're in the basic classification, but they'll be taken out of both the numerator and the denominator for the social and economic mobility work. We just don't have good enough data on international students and their outcomes for us to be able to use them. Thank you for the question. We totally understand that there's that for a lot of institutions, it's a sizable portion of who they serve and their mission of the institution, and lots of institutions that don't have a sizable international population as well. One of the things that we're thinking about when we put this new classification together is really be able to allow institutions to be able to do some sorting of the data themselves. And so, one of the filters that we are thinking about putting into the classification is one around international students, the percent of your student body that's international, so that if you're an institutional researcher or you're a third party that wants to really not only look at the institutions that are, primarily baccalaureate, but are offering master's degrees, but also want to know which of those institutions are serving an international population, we should be able to allow you to be able to do some of those sorts, or public-private, or, the types of schools that are have a sizable remote learning environment. We're going to be able to hopefully give you some tools to be able to do some further analysis on these populations.
We also had a couple questions come up about sort of designations and classifications within R2 and R1. So will there be tiers specifically? People are asking about sort of the floor and ceiling for the research expenditures seems to be quite large. And so folks had questions about kind of tiering within those categories.
Mm. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, we've been getting, I think for the last decade or so, I think there's been some push to sort of creating a super R1 group. You know, so there in 2022 there were 146 R1s, and I think that there's some that are at the high end of the expenditure scale that say, well, you know, we're spending a lot, and we're spending a lot more than the folks that are just over the line on R1, and we want to like be able to distinguish ourselves into like a better, bigger category. I think I will say I think we're unlikely to do it. You know, I think that if you're interested in different, like in doing a little bit of a different analysis within the R1 group, I'm happy to sort of talk to you about it, and I'm happy to suggest ways to be able to cut the data. Certainly, I think everybody knows there is an AAU group out there that is, you know, really dedicated to the 70 or so sort of institutions that are doing a lot of research. If you want to look at that list, I'm happy to do it, but I don't think we're going to create a distinguishment in the R1 category between types of institutions. I don't think that's really what we are trying to do. You know, an institution that's expending $75 million of expenditures and granting 100 research degrees, that's a lot of research, especially compared to the rest of sort of the higher ed ecosystem. I'm happy to label it as such. If somebody else wants to do an analysis of sort of the super high research activity institutions, happy to leave it to them, but I don't think that's likely where we're heading. I appreciate the question. I just don't think we're likely to go that way.
Excellent. So we had a few other questions specifically kind of about institutions learning of their new classification. Will it happen automatically or not?
Oh, yes. So in December, actually, let me go back 3 years. So in the last several cycles, the people who were running the classification system prior to me would send all institutions their draft classification in advance, and then give them a little bit of time to be able to both digest and be able to ask for an exception if they wanted one, or if they needed one. Not all those exception requests were granted, most of them were not, but it gave institutions some ability to be able to react. And we have a list of institutions, of contacts at all of your institutions, and we will be sending the classifications there. We're going to send something out in November, basically to test how many bounce backs we get. And so you should know both in November and then in December who on your campus is going to be able to get the information. If for some reason December 20th has come around and you haven't heard a thing from the Carnegie classification people, and you think that somebody at your institution should have, come back and find us. But please check with the chancellor and the provost first, because we're definitely sending it to chancellors, provosts, VPRs, marketing folks. You know, all of our lists aren't perfect, so maybe we're going to miss somebody somewhere, but I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to capture, hopefully we're going to have captured all 4,000 institutions. Thanks for that question.
And we have another few about kind of capturing graduates post-attendance earnings. So for example, what about students who don't get federal funds? How do you capture those graduates and post-attendance earnings? And then also evening students, like graduate and undergraduate, already have jobs. So are those earnings already calculated in the analysis, or is it just undergraduate day earnings?
Not just undergraduate day earnings. We'll look at your post-attendance earnings for everybody. You know, we've been playing with a little bit of, we're playing with exactly which time frame we're talking about, but we are likely to use 8 years after attendance, after start, to sort of be able to capture whatever the earnings are there. And if you're an evening student who's come back and is taking some classes, or you're still taking classes 8 years afterwards, whatever your earnings are at that time will count, unless you are in school. So those should count. The federally aided question, how do we account for the non-federally aided student earnings? Short answer is we won't. That what we are trying to capture here is really how well are institutions doing at sort of serving the students that are on federal aid. This is a social and economic mobility measure that's really focused on that. And so I understand that for many institutions, some institutions, many of their students are not on federal aid. And so for some of those institutions, we'll really be looking at a portion, not the entire population. But as you know, most students are on some amount of federal aid of some sort. They're either taking federal loans or on Pell Grants. We've got data on institutions. So, I mean, there are some super selective institutions for which, only 20 or 25 or 30% of their students are on federal aid, but it's a small minority of the overall institutional population.
We have a few folks that are asking for clarification on access. So just kind of explaining the access element. So for example, if a Pennsylvania state school draws more than 50% of its students from Pittsburgh and 50% from Erie, is the racial composition criteria drawn from those locations based on iPads?
Yes, it's a little bit of a complicated question there, but we will do if we've been deriving sort of a list of regional institutions, at least partially from some work that's been done by some folks that really study regional public institutions. And for those institutions that are serving, a particular population, we're going to do a regional adjustment for those populations. It gets a little bit tricky if your institution is in Western Pennsylvania and you're serving, if 50% are coming from Pittsburgh and 50% are coming from Erie, and they're in different MSAs, I think we're likely to do the regional adjustment for the place where you are located. But there's a little bit of nuance there too. It's unfortunately probably too slightly a complicated answer that I'm happy to take offline if you want to come find me afterwards. Actually, let me put my email address here. Email me, email my deputy, Sarah Gast, and we can talk a little bit about it. We're still, by the way, finalizing some of this regional adjustment work. We're pretty committed to doing it and trying to figure out exactly how to do it. Is a little bit of the devil's in the details. So I might duck some of them, but to the extent that we can answer, I'm happy to answer as much as I can.
We've got quite a few, so you're really making some progress on all these.
Hey.
So we do have a couple just kind of touching on clarifications to research and development spending.
Yeah.
So does it include all funding sources from the federal government, state and local government, institutional, industry and private nonprofit organizations, and other sources?
Yeah. So the expenditures, the spend out is something that your institution reports out to NSF HERD. You're not reporting it straight to Carnegie, and we're not doing any work on the back end. So it's whatever you're reporting out as an expenditure to NSF HERD. I don't want to speak for the HERD folks, but I will sort of just a little bit. They have a pretty darn expansive view of what counts as a research expenditure, and it includes spend from a whole bunch of different sources. So it matters a little bit less where the money's coming from and a little bit more where the money is going. I don't have at my fingertips the HERD definitions, and actually the good folks over at HERD like questions about exactly which dollars count to be directed to them. They would prefer me not to answer, so I think I will give them that ability to sort of answer the questions themselves. But it is fair to say they've got a pretty expansive view, and if it's expenditures on research, good chance that it's going to count. But thank you so much for that question.
And then we have another question on earnings. So is the earnings based on just program completers or all students?
It is all students. Yeah, that was the point of that slide that showed that only 60% of sort of students overall are completing. Now, I think it's really important for us to include all students. And one of the things that we are doing is, you'll note that in our outcomes measures, we only have one outcome. It's a straight earnings measure. And, we sometimes get the question, well, how come you're not thinking about completion? And I think that the completion is actually sort of embedded in the earnings, right? So as most of us know, at most of our institutions, right, our non-completers have lower earnings than our completers do. Makes total sense. And so in some ways, the completion is counted. I'm looking at the Q&A too, and question. I just want to read it and then respond to it if it's okay. Your method for Pell and racial enrollment does not take into account that many states have demographics that are not uniform, will be biased against institutions located in areas that are less diverse than their state overall. How will you address this flaw in your methodology? Thank you for it. I think it's part of the reason that we're trying to do a regional adjustment for exactly these types of institutions that are drawing from a particular part of the region. So just met with the president of Southern Illinois Carbondale the other day. I'm very aware that they're drawing primarily from not Chicago. And so because of that, we can do a regional adjustment. And I think that's, I wouldn't presume we've got a flaw in our methodology yet. Why don't you wait until you see what we put out? Because I think we're very much attuned to that problem. Will we get it right perfectly? Not necessarily. I mean, I think some of these regional institutions probably draw from more diverse parts of the states. And so we're actually going to probably be doing a little bit of an overcorrection for those regional institutions. But I think I'd rather err on that side. And it's definitely something that we're considering. Are we going to get it perfect? I mean, every institution's like a little bit of an end of one, but I don't want you to think that we haven't thought about that issue. We very much have. It's been top of mind for the last 6 months. Spent a lot of time looking at regional data.
Okay. This was another one that was submitted earlier, and this is just the last one. Can you suggest any resources or sources of information about Carnegie classifications or any upcoming kind of continuing education for folks who are interested more in this topic?
Oh, I love that. Thank you for asking. You probably, questioner, probably are going to the Carnegie Classifications website, carnegieclassifications.acenet.edu, like every day, like I am. And we got a little newsroom and events thing. And, you know, I think that's probably the easiest way to be able to keep track of what is coming. And we've got old webinars up there and some blog posts about like what our approach is. So keep track there, I think. And I don't know, I feel like maybe it's just because I'm the person who's at all these places, but I feel like I'm sort of out there. So like, hopefully you'll be able to come find me like relatively easily. Can I just answer? I'm sorry, Bridget, I'm just looking at these questions. Can I answer them very quickly? Because I know he asked a little while ago. And he said that he suggested a research classification for community colleges that engage in student research. Are we any closer to considering this suggestion? We are. I think that's part of the reason for this research colleges and universities category. So we have looked at the data. There will be some community colleges that are engaging in research that are going to be in this new RCU category. It's open to everybody. Right, and it hopefully will open up the imagination of everybody to what a research college and university can be. Absolutely, there are community colleges that are focused on undergraduate research, and we should highlight those institutions. I think there's a whole set of community colleges, by the way, right now that aren't really reporting all of their research because they didn't really think the Carnegie classifications were for them. You know, the research part was for them. And I'm really excited to see sort of what continuing education we can do going forward, because I can imagine that in 28, there's going to be a whole set of institutions that are really going to be focused on reporting their research dollars. And I'm excited to be able to highlight some of them. I mean, some community colleges aren't focused on research. That's great too, you know, but the ones that are, I'd like to be able to highlight if they are indeed focused on it. So are we going to create like another category? Probably not to start, but, you know, I'm always happy to sort of look at what the data looks like on research at some other point. So thank you for that. Bridget, how are we doing on time?
Down. Yeah, I'm looking through them. I think we've really slowed down on the questions that are coming in.
Okay. Here, I'm going to stop sharing.
Awesome, and we'll put our slides back up to wrap us up. Okay. So I would like to thank Mushtak. Thank you so much for participating with us. I also would like to remind all of our attendees today to please join us December 11th through the 13th at the Philadelphia Marriott downtown. This will be our annual conference. Our registration is open now on our website, and we hope to see you there. And then our final other piece is that we would like to thank Husch Blackwell once again, who sponsored this event. They're also a 2024 annual conference platinum sponsor, and will share more about their services and presentations and in the exhibit hall at this year's conference in December. We appreciate their support. And again, to learn more about their services, you can please visit huschblackwell.com. All right. Well, again, a huge thank you to Mush Talk and all of you for attending today. Thank you for attending. To learn more about future events, you can visit msche.org. And you can also follow us on all the social media platforms, YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. So thank you all for attending, and have a great rest of your day.